I'm here today with Sandy Eisenberg Sasso and Amy Jill Levine, the authors of a new book titled The Good for Nothing Tree from Flyway Books, part of Westminster John Knox Press. Amy Jill Levine, the author of numerous acclaimed books, is Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford Seminary and University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, as well as Mary Jane Wortham Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. Sandy Eisenberg Sasso is the author of many popular books for children and adults, the director of Religion, Spirituality, and the Arts Initiative at the Indiana Purdue University at Indianapolis Arts and Humanities Institute, and Rabbi Emerita of Congregation Beth El Zedek. Together, they have co-written many children's books, including A Very Big Problem, Who is My Neighbor, The Marvelous Mustard Seed, and Who Counts? You can learn more about the new book at flywaybooks.com. So it's really just such an incredible pleasure to have you both here. As I mentioned before we started the recording, my children and my grandchildren all just love your books. I've recommended them on several of our websites that list recommended children's books. So thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you've done.
Thank you for your kind words.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, it's really great to be able to do an interview with you, after all these years of you having written so many books. But before we kind of get started, maybe each of you could tell us a little bit about your background. Amy Jill, would you like to start first?
Yeah, I'm a Jew who goes to an Orthodox synagogue, but I'm not Orthodox in practice. And I'm an expert on Jesus of Nazareth and the Gospels and early Jewish-Christian relations. So what I try to do is explain Christianity to Jews and Judaism to Christians, and try to make sure that when people preach and teach the New Testament, they don't set up a toxic Jewish background and yank Jesus out of this hypothetical toxic Jewish background. But in order to get Jesus right, you have to get Judaism right. And that's what I try to help my students do.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sandy, how about you?
Well, I was the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi at the Reconstruction Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, and that was in 1974. So I was the second woman in the United States to be ordained as a rabbi. My husband, Dennis Sasso, and I married in 1970, and we are the first practicing rabbinic couple in world Jewish history.
Wow.
So I served a congregation in Indianapolis for 36 years as rabbi, Congregation Beth El Zedek. I retired in 2013, and I now direct a religion, spirituality, and arts program, as you mentioned in the introduction. And I also do a lot more of my children's writing and speaking. My particular interest, aside, of course, from being a leader in the Jewish community and being engaged with the civic community, is writing for children about their spiritual lives and helping them have stories through which they can discuss deep spiritual issues that we often don't give them credit for having the ability to engage, which I believe they do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you all take the perspectives, the approaches that you have, on your books. And, as I mentioned, you've co-authored many wonderful books. How did a children's author who's a rabbi connect with a New Testament scholar for you to get started on that journey?
Well, it's a great story. So I would hear AJ speak at a number of conferences, and I loved what she had to say. And she was speaking primarily to adults. And I remember going up to her and saying, AJ, why don't you tell this to children so you don't have to correct mistakes when people grow up? And she says, well, I don't know how to write for children. And I said, well, I don't know New Testament scholarship like you do. And we decided we should work together. And it's been a wonderful partnership. A long distance and amazing way of writing a book through the internet, but it's been an incredible experience.
Amy Jill, what's your perspective on that?
Well, that's exactly right. I have no idea how to write for children. I'm used to writing with like Greek and Hebrew and German in the footnotes. But working with Sandy has shown me, like when you write for children, every single word matters. Teasing out not only writing for children, but also making it interesting for adults, because kids' books ought not to be boring. Adults might like to read them.
And they might learn something.
Right. So sneaking in a pun on occasion so that adults go, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. And when we write, we're back and forth on email. So we might have a file that's labeled, say, February 22nd A, and that goes up to February 22nd F. And then we start again the next day. And everything is done in track change. So we go back and forth and back and forth. I find this an amazing experience. It's fun. Sandy comes up with ideas that I would never have thought about. Wow, this is great. So I'm actually inspired by this work.
Well, isn't it amazing and wonderful that we can collaborate so effectively across the miles? You know, the geographic barriers that used to be present for so much of our lives are gradually breaking down more and more.
And I've learned so much about the New Testament because AJ would say, read my book. And so I would go back and read the details of the book. And so this has been a great learning process for me as well.
So out of the books that you've already written, before we get to the new one, are there any favorites that you'd like to tell people about?
That's so hard. That's like picking your kid.
I know. I'm sorry.
I mean, I like them all for different reasons, right? I mean, I love the new book, The Good for Nothing Tree. After you work so hard and you do all those little edits, and then the book comes out and you read it, you go, wow, that really worked.
Right. And the fun thing is then you get to see what the illustrator does, because all we do is provide clues, but the illustrator also has ideas, and that helps us as well. Oh, given this, we need to change that. Or we had an artistic depiction that we hadn't actually thought of. So our words give rise to new thoughts, and we can see that in the art.
Yeah, another favorite of mine where the art really changed what we were thinking was Who is My Neighbor?
Yep.
Right. And I really love that story. It seems very timely as well. And a fun way of talking about the Good Samaritan parable, right?
Right. So what we decided to do, and this goes back to Sandy's original comment, is write books in part so that little children do not grow up with resources that suggest there's really something wrong with Judaism and then Jesus has to come fix it. Since I'm in churches a lot, at least before COVID, I'm looking at the books in their libraries, particularly what their children are reading, and some of that stuff is toxic. So I thought, Sandy and I could do this so much better than people who know nothing about the history and nothing about Judaism. So, and these are good stories, and why shouldn't Jewish kids know them as well? So it's a nice kind of interfaith system that doesn't require belief in God. If you have it, that's fine. Doesn't require accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior, but does require looking at a story that will give children ethical questions that 3-year-olds can ponder. 3-year-olds know what it's not fair is, and 3-year-olds know what it feels like when somebody's paying attention to another child, but not to them. 3-year-olds know what it's like to get a boo-boo and somebody's got to take care of it. So we thought, let's give this interreligious ethical material to little kids. How fabulous.
Yes, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the new book is The Good for Nothing Tree. And how did this one come about?
Well, this was based on the fig tree parable, which I will let AJ talk about. And I really love the story about a tree that doesn't grow and everybody discounts and says is worthless. Because how many times do we discard things because they don't grow as quick as we want them to do, like a plant? Or how many times do kids feel, they haven't quite made it, they are not successful, and they feel, well, maybe I'm not as worthy. It seems like such an important story. I love the title, which of course we had a hard time fighting, discovering, but good for nothing. Do you ever feel like sometimes, wow, you're just good for nothing. Nothing is working. And how do you engage children in having that conversation?
So we're looking at parables. This parable only shows up in the Gospel of Luke. It is likely Luke's rewriting of the story that's sometimes called the cursing of the fig tree, where Jesus curses a tree and the tree just dies. And I think Luke thought, yeah, we can probably do better. And it's basically a story about this guy who owns some land. He's got this tree. The tree isn't doing anything. So he says to the gardener, get rid of the tree. It's just using up the soil. We can put something else there. And the gardener, who may or may not have been doing a good job at this point, says, let me put a little manure on this. Let me tend it a little bit. Let's see what happens. And if still nothing happens, then you can uproot it. It's like, give it a little bit more time. And then we start thinking about our own responsibility. So if you have a little child that's not thriving quite as much, well, maybe you should be paying a little bit more attention. So we put that in, and the illustrations do a very nice job about this one little kid who's kind of hiding in the back and is not really part of the groups, but eventually gets welcomed in. We've got the care of nature, and sometimes nature requires a little bit of help from us. We've got perseverance, because caring for something is not a one-off. Like, I cared for something this morning, so now I'm done with it. But this sense of an ongoing responsibility. And a sense of what little kids can actually accomplish, because little kids can get stuff done, particularly if they're all united in a common project.
So I always think of the late bloomer. How many times do we hear parents say, oh, my child walked, at 6 months, and my child's read at 2 years. And, what happens to the late bloomer? And that's what this tree is, a late bloomer that needed nurturance and care and love. And then it could become a wonderful fig tree. And I just feel that there's so much a child can relate to in this story, whether the child is the tree, or the child is the person caring for the tree, or the child in our story is the gardener who says, let's just get rid of it. Why waste our time?
Yeah. Sandy had this great idea of putting in a recipe for fig balls at the end. Something that kids with some parental help can actually make. So, not only can you read this book, in effect, you can taste it. I think that's just a very nice addition.
Oh, I love that. So, Sandy, how can you talk a little bit about, adapting a parable for children and how you have to write it in that context?
Well, it has to be a story. Sometimes the parable needs to be filled out to have a whole life of its own. So it needs to be a story with conflict and a resolution. So I'm looking for a way to tell the story that would be engaging for children. How do we get children involved in the narrative? What role do they play? Let's take a look at the characters. The tree is a character. The gardener is a character. The child is a character. And how do we develop that fully so that children can enter that story and feel they have a place in it?
And at the same time, because adults will be reading these books to kids if kids aren't quite literate yet, adults can say, well, I had a problem with such and such a project and I had to work on it. I've been knitting this scarf since, 4 years ago, Tisha B'Av, right? I've been working on this thing forever. So the adults can engage with the children and say, yeah, sometimes it takes me a long time to finish a project. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. My work was just going downhill. So what we do in the back of each of our books is provide guidelines for the adult who's reading this book, saying, here are some of the questions you can ask your child. Here are some of the thoughts that you can share with your child, so that the reading becomes an interactive process. And that's part of parable understanding as well, because parables are designed originally to create conversation. They create buzz, and then people talk about it. So we provided the mechanism for adults and children to talk about this particular story without having like one right answer. You just engage.
I love the questions in the back of the book, and we work on those together, because the most important thing when a child reads a story, except of course from just enjoying it as a great story, is to see where they are in that story, or what part of the story is about them. And so the questions help that conversation along. And so you get to know something about your child that you might not have known before because you've never had that conversation.
Well, the way that you've used those questions to kind of encourage conversation among, parent and child about important issues, worth, patience, responsibility, perseverance. I think is really admirable and important. And, it's a bonding experience. It's a learning experience. Um, can you talk a little bit more about why you focus on that so much?
Gosh, well, those are just so important for a child's growing up. How do I decide what decisions do I make in my life regarding sticking with something that seems really difficult, that I might find it easier to give up? How do I decide if I want to help somebody who's sort of falling behind? Should I just ignore them or should I be helpful? What does it mean to be patient? Children are not particularly patient, right? I want my birthday today and I want to eat the cake before I have dinner. I'm not patient. So how do we develop a sense of patience to see what can result from meticulous care and nurturance? I just think those are so, so important. And also not to feel discouraged if it takes a long time to learn something or for something to happen.
Even more, to pay attention to nature. So instead of thinking, I have this tree, it's not doing anything, whoop, there's a tree. Well, what's the process? What happens with the buds? What do the leaves smell like? How do you know that the tree's doing okay? Do you look for bugs on the tree? What do you put on the dirt? So instead of having a start and finish, to take the time to pay attention to the process and then rejoice in all those little steps that can be made. And that's a nice way of preventing ourselves from becoming discouraged.
I spent a long time reading about fig trees, of which I did not know a lot. I learned a lot about the shape of the leaves, about what it needs to grow, about what the leaves might smell like. I had never even thought of that, about how the fruit, starts as a blossom and develops into a fruit. It helped me actually pay much more attention to nature. Things I would have not noticed before. And the wonderful thing about this story, when you pay that much attention and when you give that much care, the sweetness of the result is even greater. And that's why I was delighted to have the recipe,
Yes.
not mine, but someone else's recipe at the end of the book. So you could actually taste how sweet it is when you give your whole self to something.
Very cool. Very cool. So you all have been at this for a while, writing, children's books together. How would you say it's changed? Has it gotten easier? Has it gotten harder? Do you have to spend a lot more time on marketing these days? Can you talk about the landscape of children's book publishing?
For me, the hardest thing was getting a press to be interested, in two Jewish women writing a parable by Jesus for kids. So it's a marketing question. It's like, who's going to market this thing? And we went to a number of religion-oriented presses to say, we've got this great book. And we kept getting turned down, not because of the quality of the book, but because of the Jewish identity of the author, which we thought was a little strange, because I don't think that, 3-year-olds are going to wonder about, what do they really think about Jesus, right? 3-year-olds are not terribly engaged with questions of Christology. Until finally, Westminster John Knox and then their children's publisher Flyaway said, well, this looks like a good book. We can do this. But other presses, they wouldn't touch us.
Wow.
Yep, that is true.
Yeah, and I think a good story is a good story regardless of who tells it.
Well, and, particular with the background that the two of you have, of all the books you've written beforehand that have been so successful. That seems to speak volumes.
Well, I do think it helps that, A.G. has this incredible reputation as a New Testament scholar, and she speaks everywhere and people know her scholarship. And, and I have some notoriety as a children's book author. So, when people say, oh, these two people came together, I have to see what's happening. What I find so fascinating about this is my learning of parables, and now the Jewish community's interest in parables through the children's book. I never knew that story before. So I find it that this is such a great way for two different faith traditions to come together and talk over a story that both can relate to.
Absolutely.
Right. So it's a way of like Jews finally reading sort of the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the Good Samaritan, because we've all heard it. But very few people actually read this stuff. And when they think about it, at least what I find in churches is it immediately goes into theology. And the human part, the ethical part, drops out. So we're not taking away any of that theological stuff. All that theological stuff stays in place. We're just trying to drop back behind all that theological coding to say, what might the kernel of the story tell us about ethics or interpersonal relations, or how we deal with nature, or how we determine what's important, or how we become patient. So for Christians, it should enhance their faith, and for Jews, it should provide them a way of listening to a Jewish storyteller without quite feeling like they're being proselytized. The book that we did, God's Big Problem, originally started out as another parable, and the press didn't want it. They thought it was too difficult. Ooh. So Sandy had this great idea of saying, well, let's take it out of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20 and throw it into the book of Genesis chapter 1, and it worked brilliantly.
Yeah,
So
it's a long process to write these things. I mean, for example, which was the Good Samaritan, we tried many different ways of getting into that story, and none of them felt right until we scrapped everything and started all over with blues and yellows as the main characters. And it allowed us this creative way of entering this parable that was funny and very engaging.
Although the illustrator at one point, part of the story is one of the blue people gets into a bicycle accident and bangs up his knee. And so the blue person has to go to a doctor who turns out to be one of the yellow people, Dr. Gold, because what else would it be? And Dr. Gold has to put a Band-Aid on the blue person's knee, but it turned out these are stick figures. They didn't have knees. So, and here's where you have to work with the illustrator just to make sure that the illustration does in fact match.
Wow, what a process that must be to go through to do these. So I have to ask, if you got anything in the future that you're working on that you're able to talk about, something together?
We don't have anything right now.
We don't. Getting this present one out has been quite a long process, and then delayed to begin with, and then delayed also because of COVID. So I haven't seen the book yet.
Neither have I.
Yeah, so you've got the book. We haven't seen it. We know it was on display at the Presbyterian Educators Program last week in Chicago because a friend took a picture of it for us, but we actually haven't seen the book yet. But I would be delighted to do another one.
I would as well. I do have 2 children's books coming out over time. The one that might be of interest to this audience is I am doing a book on Psalm 23. For children with Beaming Press.
Oh, good.
So that was a slightly different take. And then I have a book coming out about the first woman rabbi, Sally Prisan, who's celebrating her 50th anniversary this year. But I would love working with AJ, and it would be wonderful to be able to do another book again.
Well, I certainly hope that you do, because, as I said, they've been so meaningful to so many people, so many children in particular. So I really encourage that. Hope it works out. Again, the title of this book is The Good for Nothing Tree. You can learn more about it at Flyaway Books. Sandy and Amy Jill, thanks so much for all the work that you've done. Thanks for telling us about it, and I really wish you the best.
Thanks for letting us have this conversation with you. I like talking about these books. They're fun.
Thanks for having us.